This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. Yayha Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip and head of the group's political bureau, was killed by Israeli forces on October 16th. His death sparked contrasting reactions. While the West has largely endorsed the killing of a man Israel considers as quote unquote the mastermind of the October 7, 2023 attack, Palestinians, Arabs, and other actors across the Middle East have hailed him as a quote unquote martyr and a hero who will inspire Palestinians to continue their fight for self determination and statehood.
وبكل الأحوال الله يرحمه مات مناضل مات شهيد شريف.
Some commentators in the West also see in Sinwar's passing an opportunity for a ceasefire, return of the Israeli hostages, and a strategic reshaping of the region in favor of Israeli and American interests. So, what does Sinwar's death mean for Hamas? Will it help or hinder the prospects of a ceasefire in Gaza? What does Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu mean when he said that the war is not over despite the killing of Sinwar, Ismail Haniyeh, and much of the top leadership of Hezbollah? We explore these developments in the region following Sinwar's death in this episode of In Focus, and we have with us Dr. Andreas Krieg, Associate Professor in the School of Security Defense Studies Department, Institute of Middle Eastern Studies at King's College, London. Andreas, welcome to In Focus. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good morning.
So, Andreas, to start with, I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit about what Sinwar's death means for Hamas, especially the military resistance in Gaza, which he was purportedly leading, and also in terms of succession to the position that he held so far as head of the political bureau and so on.
Yeah, difficult to say at this point who can replace someone like Sinwar. So since he was released in 2011, he really rose through the ranks as the most prominent leader of Hamas, not just in Gaza, but also, part of the wider regional movement. And that's due to the fact that he was an intellectual as much as he was a fighter. And obviously, over the last 12 months, he really built this he kind of reconstituted the organization from a largely political sort of governance organization within Gaza into a militant organization. And, what we see after the degradation of Hamas into what it is today, we're basically seeing a bunch of fairly loosely connected cells of militant actors. And he was kind of the hub in this network of different cells that was still holding the organization together, but more as a militant organization rather than a social political or a governance organization. So Hamas is unable to govern. But he's been fairly inspirational for most of the fighters, and that's where I think his loss will be most deeply felt, because he was a charismatic, almost spiritual leader for most of the people within the militant wing of the organization. And his death now means that militants will definitely find it very hard to connect with one another. So you have these different cells across the Gaza Strip. They will continue fighting. What the mistake the Israelis made, though, is releasing that video of his last breath, where he's throwing a stick at a drone, which has was supposed to be directed at an audience within Israel to show that how he died. But obviously, it instantly made him a hero among Palestinians and Arabs, who say he's actually, unlike many other Arab leaders, he was someone who was in the field. He was fighting the enemy, and he died fighting the enemy. So that kind of created this martyrdom myth, and I think that's something that will probably stick with a lot of people and inspire a lot of people also in the Gaza Strip to continue fighting. And I don't think it will have the effect of, it might have an impact on the organizational structure, but I don't think it will have an impact on the ability and willingness, particularly the willpower of militants to continue fighting, which I think is very, very important. I think it will inspire more to join and potentially keep the fight going.
Right. I mean, thank you for that, Andreas. I mean, an important point there about both the mistakes the Israelis made in releasing that video, and also the fact that Sinwar was an intellectual and not just a fighter. Now, coming to that second part of my question in terms of succession, there are some reports which indicate that no successor might be announced purely from a security point of view, so that he doesn't draw the attention of the Israelis who might try to assassinate him again. And there are also some reports which suggest that some of the next in line leaders who are based in Qatar, who are in charge of maybe West Bank or other territories, might be in line to succeed Sinwar. What are your thoughts on that discussion?
Well, the leader is, and we've seen this development. I think we're seeing now a split between the political wing, which is the kind of representative office that they have in Doha in Qatar, and the militant organization. And we've seen that split over the last 12 months already. And obviously, with the killing of Haniyeh, who was assassinated by the Israelis in Iran, who was the political leader, with his assassination already, this split was kind of started to really ferment itself. And I think
What exactly do you mean? Do you mean by split? Do you mean by split? Do you mean their inability to communicate with each other, or do you mean they are at odds with each other in terms of their goals?
Yes, I think it is, because what is left of Hamas within the Gaza Strip is a militant organization, one where those who were even someone like Sinwar was someone who was willing to engage in dialogue. I mean, he was willing to negotiate for a bit. I mean, I wouldn't call him a moderate, obviously, but he's someone who was at least willing to engage. I think what is left now, because of the decimation of the operational wing as well as the strategic leadership in Gaza, are militants. And so the organization will be run by militants, and militants don't have a track record of engaging in diplomacy. And then you have that political office. And I think it will be very difficult for the political office, obviously, that is fairly moderate, that is willing to engage with Israel if Israel was to make a step into the direction of Palestinian statehood. These individuals are not necessarily at odds, but they're increasingly intellectually and cognitively and obviously physically separated from those militants on the ground. And it will be very difficult for them in Doha, for example, to negotiate on behalf of those people and those militants on the ground.
Right. You said, I mean, they are intellectually and cognitively separate, but the bottom line here is that they are not able to be in communication, right? I mean, Israel has basically dismantled all channels of communication. It controls all exits and entries, and of course the airwaves. Is that also the main reason for the split?
No, because for a long time, until the killing of Haniyeh, there was direct contact. I mean, the Qataris obviously and the Egyptians have been very key in the mediation process of using that office in Doha to get to Sinwar and to get to those people on the ground, and communication worked. And Haniyeh was able to also extract concessions from Sinwar that most people thought were never possible. Now they killed Haniyeh, which really disrupted communications with the Gaza Strip, and now they killed the other communication hub, which was Sinwar. And now you're lacking a central communication hub in Gaza through which you could communicate with the various cells. And I think that's why dialogue diplomacy is certainly not something that we should be too hopeful for, because it's very difficult now to find a coherent position with those who are left in the Gaza Strip. And I think you're right. I mean, they won't probably announce anyone anytime soon. There's discussion about Sinwar's brother Mohammed potentially taking over, and he comes very much firmly from the militant wing. Very radical as well. And I think it's bad news for Israel, because you end up with a more radical organization, and one that's probably more willing to fight than actually entering into dialogue.
Right. When you're pretty clear that the hope for dialogue and negotiations are now much dimmer than what they were before Sinwar's demise. But what now happens to the entire hostage situation?
Well, that's the big question mark. So obviously, we've seen the U.S. administration trying to use the opportunity before the elections in the United States to kind of suggest that there is an off ramp. Excuse me, there is a diplomatic off ramp now to get the hostages back. I'm very pessimistic about this. As I said, these hostages were not held by Sinwar. They were held by locals on the ground, by different cells across the Gaza Strip. They have now find it very difficult, if maybe even impossible, to communicate with one another. And you would have to find a way to communicate with each cell separately and strike a deal. And I don't think that's necessarily something that those militants on the ground would want to do. And it is just, in terms of logistics, extremely difficult to actually find a consistent sort of position. And I think what the Israelis are trying to do, and what Netanyahu has been trying to do for the last 12 months, is basically an approach of scorched earth. where you destroy the physical infrastructure, you expel Palestinians from the land that they live on. Particularly, we're seeing that now in northern Gaza, where people are being driven out. And as they cleanse the overground, they're trying to go into the tunnels, see what they can find. But we've seen that there is no military solution to getting the hostages back. Every time there was a special forces operation that was close to getting the hostages, the hostage takers would kill the hostages. So that's likely going to happen as well. So I think for the fate of the hostages, I'm extremely pessimistic, I have to say, for them to get out alive.
Right. I mean, speaking of scorched earth policy of Netanyahu, Andreas, I mean, when Israel started its military assault on Gaza, the Israeli leadership announced two goals: one, the destruction of Hamas, and two, getting the hostages back. Now, as far as the first one is concerned, I mean, one could probably conclude that it has been achieved. Their top two leaders, Ismail Haniyeh and now Sinwar, are both gone. Their military infrastructure is more or less finished, except for, as you said, these disparate cells which are putting up some kind of a fight. And as far as the hostages are concerned, of course, I mean, it's very difficult to see how they're going to get them back, negotiating with individual cells. But Netanyahu, despite all these goals being achieved, so much ground has been covered, so much of destruction has happened. He has still said, as recently as last week, that the war is by no means over. So, how do we interpret this? Because there has been no let up in attacks on Gaza and now Lebanon. And every day we hear reports of a new spate of killings, some would say massacres. So, what is the end game here for Netanyahu?
Well, the end game for Netanyahu from the beginning has been self-preservation, has been keep staying in power, and being able to to continue lead what is the most far-right extremist government in Israeli history. However, I kind of disagree with your point about them having achieved the goal of annihilating Hamas. Hamas is not defeated militarily, and it's difficult to do it, or I would probably say impossible to do, because it's an idea. The idea of resistance, armed resistance, is still very strong. And yes, it's a degraded organization where, with the central leadership, there's a kind of core periphery sort of dynamic going on in that network. The core has been destroyed. However, on the periphery, all these cells kind of operate independently of each other anyway, with a large degree of autonomy. I think there's still thousands and thousands of fighters, some of them also very good fighters, in the tunnels. The tunnel infrastructure in Gaza is still intact, not, has been again degraded. I'd say probably 30-40% of the tunnels are still available, are still there. And this is where Hamas is fighting from and holding out. So even if they seize ground, which they have done, they don't actually seize the underground. So Hamas as an organization is still alive. As a militant wing, it's still alive, probably more radical than ever, and is probably still posing a threat to Israel. And there isn't going to be a military way to defeat Hamas. That's just not going to happen. You have to kill every single potential fighter in the Gaza Strip to achieve that goal, and that's not going to happen. And it comes at a gigantic humanitarian cost that is obviously unacceptable, unethical. We've seen war crimes being committed. So, in this cause, I think Israel has destroyed the very soul of what it once was, what it wanted to present to the world. And in that respect, for Hamas, this is a victory, even though there is degradation. So I think this war will continue. The Israelis themselves are saying, this is going to be a very slow approach, where they're now trying to unravel whatever's happening in the north of the Gaza Strip, trying to push people out, destroy physical infrastructure, try to go into the tunnels, and then block by block, town by town, moving southwards, driving out hundreds of thousands of people from their homes, never to be returned, because we've seen what I said, scorched earth means that, large swathes of the infrastructure in the Gaza Strip have completely disappeared. This sort of destruction, I think, we haven't seen in modern history. And it will continue, and it will likely take another 18 months, if not 2 years.
I see your point about Hamas being extremely degraded but not really being destroyed, quote unquote, because there is this core periphery dynamic, as you put it. Now, what is he trying to do by expanding the war to Lebanon? Because now, I mean, yesterday there were Lebanese, not just Hezbollah, but Lebanese army soldiers were killed in Israeli strikes. I mean, they have attacked UN interim forces there. So, what is going on with Israel's calculations in Lebanon?
Well, the Israelis think it's a different battlefield and a different war, although for Hezbollah and for Lebanon and for most Arabs, it's the same war. all the root cause of all these conflicts is the lack of Palestinian statehood, as simple as that. I mean, you can't divorce what's happening in Palestine from what's going on with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And obviously the war, as much as Israel is saying this is a war against Hezbollah, it has been a war in Lebanon. I mean, the destruction, again, physical destruction, death across all communities. It's not just Shia communities who are suffering. Christians are suffering. Sunni Arabs, as Sunnis are suffering in Lebanon. So, Lebanon is being hit. The cost of rebuilding already, we're now in the tens of billions in Lebanon, the economic costs as well, the physical destruction in the south. Very difficult, but we're also seeing that Hezbollah is far from being defeated. Again, we've seen the degradation, decimation of the central core of Hezbollah, but the fighting wings, the infantry wings on the ground in the south of Lebanon, the south of the Litani River, are still very much fighting, and they're keeping up a very, very fierce battle. Israel has not made a lot of progress in terms of seizing and particularly holding ground in southern Lebanon, considering that we're now a month into ground operations. They haven't even been able to kind of secure a 1 kilometer or 2 kilometer belt along the Lebanese Israeli border, which we thought would be fairly swift. But it's also, the Israelis are very careful. They know they don't want to get dragged into a muddy quagmire like they did in 2006. However, nonetheless, they are still, they're not making that much progress, or as much progress as they hoped, and it comes at a very, very high cost as well for the IDF. So, but by saying this was a limited war, although it's not a limited war in terms of destruction, the Israelis have created themselves an off-ramp by which they can say, we could bring this to a conclusion fairly quickly because we degraded Hezbollah. But again, degradation means Hezbollah will survive. Hezbollah will move back into the areas that the Israelis have cleared. They still have large stockpiles of weapons that they can and are using against Israel. Actually, despite everything, what we see is despite this heavy onslaught on Hezbollah missile strikes on Israel have escalated over the last 4 weeks. So it shows that they're extremely resilient, and this is not a war that Israel can win anytime soon. And I think the high costs, the casualties that Israel has suffered over the last 4 weeks suggests that the Israelis might not have a stomach for a long war in Lebanon and might potentially call it a win. The question is, I mean, that's the Israeli security sector and the IDF. The question is, Netanyahu himself, who's in it for political survival, will he actually admit to that, or will he, keep on going in an atrocious war, in a war of attrition that neither side is really winning, because that is something that is boosting his popularity domestically. And while he was down a year ago, Netanyahu is now very much up again as the leader, and loads of people would probably vote for him in the next election.
Right. I mean, a war of attrition in Lebanon and a war in Gaza, which cannot be settled militarily, at least without solving the Palestinian problem. Now, the third front, which is Iran. I mean, do you think an Israeli retaliatory strike on Iran is still on the cards? Because it's been quite a while now since the Iranian strikes happened. And if yes, is there a possible form that the Israeli strike could take, such that we may have a reasonable expectation that Tehran may not escalate, because there are fears that Israel might strike its nuclear facilities or its oil facilities, oil infrastructure. So is there a way of Israel has made it very clear that it will retaliate. So what form do you think it could take that might be quote unquote safe?
Well, the hope for the international community is that we're getting out of this tit for tat, where we're saying this is, that's the end of it. No more red lines being crossed. Israel will have to respond. I can't see Israel not responding. Even obviously they're playing with it, and the fear of a retaliatory strike obviously is a kind of psychological war in itself against the Iranians. And so the longer they drag this out, the more they probably can reap some benefits from that. I think there are certain red lines that the Americans have set. Israel is not really deterred, despite the fact that the attack on Israel was kind of unprecedented and certainly hit very much deep in the heart of the Israeli psyche. They're willing to do whatever it takes and to really punish, because that's what it's all about, punish Iran for what they've done. But the Americans have said very clearly, that you mustn't attack the oil infrastructure, hydrocarbon infrastructure within Iran, because it will have massive repercussions for the rest of the Gulf and obviously oil markets. And they also said striking the nuclear program itself will be, a drop in the bucket, considering that actually most of that program is so deep underground that you will, you at most degrade it, but you won't destroy it. It's not like the operation the Israelis conducted against Iraq in the 1980s, where they destroyed one single reactor and that was the end of it. That's not the case in Iran. And so what we're probably going to see is a couple of missiles being launched, possibly outside of Iranian airspace by the Israeli Air Force, being launched on targets which are, infrastructure targets, potential critical national infrastructure like power grid, attacks on the IRGC, especially those who are involved in the missile program, but also others, and military bases. And I think the red lines for the Iranians or the metric they're going to look at is what's not just physical destruction, but how many of their own people are being killed, particularly civilians. I think if civilians are being harmed, Iran will respond. It's questionable to what extent casualty figures among IRGC will be used as a metric to retaliate. And then obviously, will Israel strike any senior leadership and potentially eliminate them? I think that will be another sort of red line where the Iranians say now we'll have to respond again.
Right. When you spoke about the US setting certain red lines for Israel in its retaliatory matrix. Now, taking a step back from the immediate scenario, there have been media reports in certain quarters about a mega deal, quote unquote, mega deal involving the US, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. This is the post October 7, entire military confrontation scenario. Once it has sort of reached some kind of an equilibrium, if not, peace or a ceasefire. So under this mega deal, apparently Gaza would go under reconstruction, and it would sort of be some kind of an Emirati kind of a territory, which would be controlled by the Arabs and the Israelis in return for security guarantees for Israel, and with Saudi Arabia coming under US military guarantees. So what are the chances, do you think, of such a geopolitical arrangement coming through, given that it was this Arab-Israeli convergence which was happening, which the October 7 attacks seem to be aimed at scuttling?
Well, the chances are now zero. Absolutely not going to happen. And that has to do with the fact that, particularly the Saudis now, the alienation among Arabs, among Middle Easterners about what Israel is doing, obviously they're calling it a genocide. I'm a bit more hesitant to use that word, but what they're doing, the slaughter, the massacres that are happening in Gaza, 45,000 civilians killed, unprecedented. And that is something that no Arab leader can just kind of overlook and just say we're going to strike a deal with Israel. I think Israel itself is now, and when we say Israel, it's not directed against all of Israel. I think there's still a hope that a normal Israel under a normal leadership would be a partner even for the Saudis to work with, but not this radical Kahanite, ideological, almost theocratic leadership that we have in Israel now. And we don't see that this leadership is going to go anywhere anytime soon. The radicalization that has happened since the 7th of October across Israel is gone far beyond just those, these marginal, fairly marginal 20% of the population who are religious nationalists. And so, Israel as a country has shifted massively as well. So the hope that you have a normal government with which you can have a grown-up conversation about regional peace and security, where Israel sees itself as an intricate part of regional security, the chances for that are pretty much zero. I mean, the Emiratis obviously have their own deal with the Israelis, which was mostly about trade and growth. They are also very alienated by what Israel is doing. But the Abraham Accords were a very Emirati thing. It's an Emirati project. The Saudis were never part of that and never wanted to be part of it. And the Saudi deal will be very different if there ever is going to be one. And the big question mark here is also, will the United States be able to actually deliver on the promises of providing the Saudis with a defense deal? I'm very skeptical about this because there is not a lot of support in Washington on either side of the political aisle for a defense treaty which would potentially tie the United States to another Middle Eastern power, for which they will then have to go to war with if necessary. And I think the Saudis have found alternatives. And I think that's the greatest outcome and the greatest loss for Israel and the United States in this war has been the fact that the Saudis are now very openly, very warmly engaging the Iranians. All the GCC countries, all the Gulf countries are engaging with the Iranians and saying, okay, pragmatically speaking, we don't like what they're doing, but we need to have that relationship. We can't rely on the Americans to provide for peace and security. And the greatest, I think, the power that suffers the most since the 7th of October is the United States. Their role, the credibility of their leadership, the credibility of their security partnership, has been widely undermined across the Arab world. And as an outcome of this, the US are no longer a convening power. They're unable to kind of get their local partners in the Gulf to do what they want them to do. And that kind of leads to more multipolarity across the region. And, it will make it impossible at this point, even in the foreseeable future, for the Saudis to strike any deal with the Israelis.
Right. The chances of this mega deal are, according to you, are more or less zero. One last question, Andres, before I let you go. No, there is a sense in many quarters that what Netanyahu is trying to do in terms of airstrikes over Lebanon, unending, intense destruction in Gaza. I think that he seems to be working towards some kind of a deadline, which seems to be the U.S. elections. What exactly is this calculation with the U.S. elections and the Biden administration being the incumbent there? Is there going to be a shift in terms of the Israeli strategy once the elections are over? What is the calculation vis-a-vis the American elections in terms of its being a factor in the Israeli strategy towards this entire war in the region?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, we are working towards a deadline. The November elections in the United States were always some sort of deadline for what's going to happen next in the Middle East. However, I think there are a lot of miscalculations on the side of Netanyahu. He thinks that a Kamala Harris government would be probably tougher on him based on human rights. Maybe not tougher in terms of in terms of enforcing the red lines, but there will be more friction. Let's put it that way. Netanyahu hopes that Trump would be someone he can deal with. He has a good personal relationship with, and that will allow him to do the things he wants to get done in terms of settlements, normalization in the West Bank, which is more and more annexation of Palestinian land. A potential, there's now talk in Likud, which is a ruling party in Israel, of resettling the Gaza Strip with Jewish settlers. That is possible. He hopes that Trump would be up for that. I think the miscalculation is, though, that Donald Trump is not a principled man. He's not someone who has any strong personal affinity to Israel per se. He's someone he likes to win. He likes a deal. And he certainly doesn't want to get dragged into a conflict in the Middle East that will cost taxpayers money and potentially needs American boots on the ground. He's very isolationist in this respect. And the last thing he wants is being kind of manipulated, which is what basically has happened over the last 12 months, being manipulated by an Israeli prime minister, where you have a situation where the tail is wagging the dog, if you were. And I think Donald Trump is not someone who would be played as much as Joe Biden has been played by Netanyahu. And I think that's an overestimation or underestimation on the side of Netanyahu, that he thinks he can control Donald Trump. I don't think he will. I think a Donald Trump administration might be quite, will be very tough on Israel of getting out of this quagmire of these various front lines that are basically unwinnable wars, where there is no strategy, and where Israel is actually left less secure and less stable afterwards.
Right. I mean, it's quite ironic that the future of peace in the Middle East would rest on a man without principles and a man the liberal, progressive establishment in the US considers a big threat across the board. Thank you so much, Andreas, for joining us, for your observations and insights on this very, very complicated situation in the Middle East. Hopefully, we'll talk again, and by then things will be much better. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Let's hope so. Thank you.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.